Andy Grover, how are you?
I'm doing awesome. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, thank you for making the time today. You are the executive director, I can do this, of the Idaho Association of School Administrators. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I nailed it. Took me like
well.
5 minutes today. Thank you. Now, underneath the Association of School Administrators, you have different branches like the Superintendent's Association, and I think there's also like a Principal Association. This is separate from the IEA, which is the Idaho Educators Association, separate from the ISBA, which is the School Boards Association, and also separate from the PTA.
That's correct.
Okay, so a lot of different education ones.
We're an umbrella organization. So we have superintendents, we have secondary principals, elementary principals, and special ed directors.
Gotcha. Okay, so you essentially have four fingers that kind of span out, and those are capturing different administrative bodies.
Correct.
Understood. You also were a superintendent in Melba for some time and were very successful in turning around that district. Before you went into, again, the position you're in now, talk to me about what was required to turn this around, because obviously the big question in the state of Idaho now is, look, we have House Bill 93, the school choice bill that got passed and got signed by the governor. And the thing I keep trying to get people to articulate, I had Representative Hostetler in here, Clinton Hostetler, and I said, look, if you had to deliver a list of things that needed to be fixed in your mind, because he was very critical of public education, and you had to deliver this to Superintendent Debbie Critchfield, what would be on that list? Like, what do people want from public education to be happy with it? Is it test scores? Is it, politically neutral classrooms? Is it, no flags? What is it that you want to see a successful school? Now, from a quantitative standpoint, we don't know what that is because it's very hard to pin down. But from a quantitative standpoint, you were very successful in bringing up the Melba school district that you were superintendent on, right?
We were very successful, and it goes back to what's important in our community, right? What does the community want? They want their kids to graduate. They want them to have opportunities to do whatever's next, right? And in order to do that, you have to look at the state and say, okay, what does graduation requirements entail? And for the most part, it's still reading, writing, and arithmetic, and being able to do those things. So when you start looking at scores, and that's what you have to do, you have to say, where are our kids at? Instead of wishing that they're up here, you have to say, here they are. This is where they're actually at. We got to meet them where they're at if we're actually going to move, the needle at all. And it's painful at first because it's not like we didn't have good teachers. We just didn't have good direction, if that makes sense, right? And so recreating direction and changing the direction you're going takes time and effort. And that's what we did. And we put all our time into it. We started in the downturn, when we cut a quarter of our budget out and we got rid of almost all our electives and said, we're focusing on the core. And then as it got better, we added in, different things back in. But we really put our focus on the core, and then we used IDLA for some of, the other classes. But we allowed students to look at what they wanted. We also allowed them to have a voice in what is it you want to do in high school, right? What do you want to do after high school? And we included CTE courses. You can earn welding and CNA courses and all these different things that got people excited about education as well. The thing our teachers did, and they did really well, was being able to identify every student and where their needs were. And that's what moves the needle, right? Being able to say, this particular student can't do fractions, can't add, can't whatever. And then we can fill in those spots with extra help or whatever we needed. And it took us about 5 years to go from the bottom 30 percentile to top 25 percentile.
Okay. Question for you. When you're assessing how to essentially strip down, and it sounds like from budgetary needs, strip down and focus on the core things. This is one thing that I keep coming back to with people, which is, hey, look, do you have a problem with the 3 R's, right? Reading, writing, arithmetic. Does anybody have a problem with these? And the answer is overwhelmingly no. But people criticize public education for cultural things, right? Like, hey, I don't like, having this flag or that flag, things of that nature. They feel, and what it essentially comes down to is there's a wide swath of scope creep that people feel the public education system is engaging in, and they do not like it. Right. They don't have a problem with the 3 R's, but they don't want, what people term wokeism and things of that nature creeping into the school. And people argue that public schools feel that it's their duty to do these things. Now, again, I'm not saying this is just what I hear people reporting that are the most critical of public education systems. But when you're stripping down the system in Melba to build it back up from a solid core of like, hey, look, we have to accomplish these things right here at all costs. Was there a lot of pushback there? Because I feel like that may be what's on the horizon for a lot of public education in Idaho.
So there wasn't necessarily a ton of pushback because we really looked at and asked the community, what do you want, right? What is it you guys want? You want our kids to be down here and failing? No one wants that, right?
Sure.
And so when you bring them a plan and say, this is how we're going to get better, and they're part of that conversation, we didn't have a lot of pushback, and once you achieve, that the goal that you've set out, and they still fall in that 50, 60% in the state, that's, kids are doing well and they're learning and they're coming out with CTE certifications. They're coming out with, 2-year degrees. They have it all. And I think that's, success breeds success, right? And so once we started down that program and we were able to move kids in a direction where they see success and they own that success, kids go home and tell their parents come in and thank us. So I think part of that is just getting the word out and letting people know what you're doing and why you're doing it.
What's unique then about Melba? Because what I hear a lot is, hey, my school district's not listening to me, right? How did you guys communicate with your community in that your community was like, okay, look, they get it. They're doing the right thing. Now, look, the Melba School District is just larger. It's just slightly larger than the Marsing School District. And Marsing is just over 800 students, right? So Melba is also very small and very intimate. So I'm sure people can connect with you very easily.
Yeah. So again, everybody had my cell phone number, right? It wasn't a secret. And I lived in the community for most of my career out there. But I think it's a couple things. One, the squeaky wheel always seems to get the grease. And it's also, in a system of almost 1,000 kids, they're not all going to be happy, right? And that's why we have choice in Idaho. We have charters, we have online schools, we have all kinds of different choices that maybe somebody will fit in better. And we did have kids leave that were not happy with where Melba was going, but it was very few. And those type of parents usually have a hard time accepting anything you're going to do, right? And again, with 900 plus kids and double that amount of parents, it's not that we don't listen to parents, but we're still going to do what's better, what's best for the group of students that's coming through the system, and sometimes people don't like that. And again, the beauty of the state of Idaho is we have choice everywhere, and we've had it for a long time. This isn't a new conversation.
Gotcha. With the new law on school choice getting enacted, we will have a huge chunk of money, $50 million, going to private educations. And what I'm trying to figure out is who will that affect the most? Now, naturally, it will affect people who have the option to go to private school. So if you live in an area with no private school, you don't really have the opportunity to use that $5,000 for private school. Great. But it seems that it's predominantly going to be affecting the Treasure Valley, right? And the school districts here. So you have Boise School District, right? You got Nampa, you got West Ada. These are gigantic school districts as far as the state of Idaho goes. And they also happen to be home to the widest variety of private schools as well.
Well, but I think what you're going to see over time is one, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict. All I can do is look.
Come on, man.
All I can do is look at the states next to us, right?
Okay.
And what's happened in those states is that you see, first of all, those dollars go to the wealthy class that already has their kids in those areas, right? So this is usually a tax credit for the wealthy. And when Arizona did their last data poll, the majority of the money went to the top, or the most expensive zip codes in Phoenix, and I think you're going to see the same thing in Idaho, right? Those people already are in the system. They have good accountants. They know how to play the game, if you will. So I think it's going to benefit those kids that are already in the system currently. I don't think there's going to be a lot of new kids moving over to, and there's not a ton of room in these schools either. So unless they build new buildings and things like that, they're, next to capacity for the most part. And the other thing is we don't even know how many kids actually go to private schools, right? It's kind of like the homeschool question. We don't know those numbers. Those are numbers we all guess at. And so, again, I think what you're going to see is that next year they're going to come back and say, man, look at all these people that took the money. It was gone in a month. We got to make it bigger, right? We got to help more Idahoans. And again, we're not creating something new. We're just paying. Choice has always been there. This is a complete question about who's going to pay for it. And it's our rural districts and these little, the majority of our districts are 600 kids or less. Those are the people that are paying for the kids to come to the urban areas to go to the private schools.
What has happened in other states in the years immediately following the passage of voucher school choice, however you want to term it?
Almost every single one of them balloons, right? It gets opened up more. I think it was 3 years ago that Arizona went to, a universal voucher and went from $50 million to almost $1 billion. They're 900 and some million now in 3 years. And the problem in Idaho, we don't have the capacity to handle that. We just don't have enough taxpayers. And, we give enough tax credit or tax breaks through each year that we don't generate that kind of income to create a third educational pipeline to take taxpayers' dollars. But again, back to your question, I think you're going to see it get bigger and bigger and bigger each year that it goes on.
Okay, how can you explain something to me? And again, I'm very ignorant on this issue. Arizona is both viewed as an exam evidence of success and evidence of failure. It like in the same sentence by people. I have heard the ballooning budget problem. Okay. How is the Arizona voucher system viewed as a success of voucher systems?
Well, the success is that anybody can access it. You and I, if we had kids that were of age, we could homeschool them and say, hey, we need our whatever dollar amount is from the state because we're homeschooling our kids. They're not going to, a traditional public education or a charter school. So we would be able to access it. So people are saying, well, that's parent choice, right? The parent gets to choose how their kid's educated. Whether they're educating them or not, that's a whole different question. We've already seen the abuse cases coming out of, family in Colorado that was charging folks in Arizona that I can't remember how many kids, 20 or 30 kids. You're already seeing those kind of things happen.
Wait, back up. There was a family in Colorado that was charging the state of Arizona for 30. Like, how does that work? What do you mean?
They just applied for it. They applied for the grant and they're being prosecuted, right? But again, free money equals fraud. I don't care what system you're in, right? And so we're seeing that kind of stuff now. We see kids that go on trips to Europe and all kinds of great things. So those are the kind of things that we're seeing in other states that's being accepted, right? We've seen in Florida people going to Disney World and going to theme parks and, they're able to write that stuff off. Even with empowering parents in Idaho, we've seen some things that are questionable and, state board has to go through every single one of those and figure out if it's a usable expense or not. So now we're going to increase that to 50 million. Oh, wait, there's no accountability. Never mind. That's just money gone.
Gotcha. So bottom line is they have universal access, and that's being touted as a big success. As they've increased from $50 million to almost $1 billion in Arizona, did they decrease the amount of funding and need going to the public school as well? Or was this just an additional $1 billion line item?
So it's an additional $1 billion line item. Now, the difference is there's not tons of new money going into the system, right? And again, in Idaho, even if you look at our budgets today, if they don't put money in operations, for example, our operation costs over the last 2 years have gone up 20, 30% in all our little areas. So, I still got to pay for the lights. I don't control, how much water costs. I don't control how much electricity costs. I don't control how much food costs. So when those prices go up, I only have one way to get money for that, and that's by the legislators appropriating it. So if they don't appropriate, my only other option is to go out and do a supplemental levy and tax our local communities, which that's the last thing any of us want to do. Going out and asking people for money is not a good time.
Right. So bottom line is that if there was, let's say, $1 billion going to public education in the first place, then they said, all right, look, we have this other $1 billion over here. So education now is going to be a $2 billion collectively, $2 billion expense to the state of Arizona. That's roughly like how this has worked. Okay, so that's not good.
No, and you can even
wait. Why couldn't we just take the? It's like we have schools that are falling apart already.
And you can take even when we started really producing charter schools, and I have nothing against charter schools. I think there's some incredible charter schools out there. Sure. But initially they were set up not to receive facility funding, right? And over the last 3 or 4 years, guess what? We're putting facility funding in those, and saying here's money for facilities because they can't operate. They have to be able to pay for their facilities, and they're not allowed to bond or run levies, right? So they have no way to increase funds to pay for their facilities, right? So now you're seeing a bigger drain on those, and we're almost 80 charters and there's 115 school districts. So we've almost in, a little over a decade created almost as many charter districts as we have traditional districts. So we have two systems that feed off, the lowest funded per student state in the union. And now we're going to add a third leg to that. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out and where the money comes from.
Besides ballooning budgets, have we seen any increase in surrounding states or states who've been at this a while? Have we seen increase in educational results?
So one, private schools don't have to share that information, right? There's no option we have no control over that. This money is given freely and there's no obligations, where both a charter school district and a traditional school district, we take the ISAT test, we take IRI.
Sure.
There's all kinds of data points for the state to say, are you doing well or are you failing?
Right.
There's no way to know that for sure. Now, other states that tout they have some data doesn't show great increases in either. And, when you look at a lot of charters, their scores aren't outstandingly different from a lot of the traditional districts, right? So, we're all doing a pretty good job with what we're given, and we fall in pretty well in this, in all the states. Academically, we do pretty well.
Okay. So it's a ballooning budget item. We're not getting conclusively better results from educational outcomes, which is important to know. Have there been any, I've been very curious about this. Are you familiar if there have been any discrimination lawsuits? Because that's one of the big tickets for private schools, which is, hey, they get to select on, I have a friend who actually applied to, I think it was Ambrose, and she didn't get in. She happens to be in the LDS community, and they asked her some specific questions, and maybe it wasn't Ambrose. I can't remember, but it was a school that was very Christian oriented, totally fine. And she was like, hey, I'm mostly with you guys, but we're Mormon, and here's my kid, and my kid's great, and I think I'm all right, and and the school, again, can't remember exactly which one it was, but it was like, yeah, no, we're not going to take you. We want people that are very, very specifically our version of Christianity.
Yeah, so I think the best quote I've heard is that it's not school choice, it's the school's choice. Right?
I hadn't heard that. That's pretty good.
I think that's the best thing that is, and that's that's been the beauty of a private school, is they get to choose, because they didn't take state dollars. So the state couldn't influence in any way who they took or who they didn't take. And with the current bill that just passed, that's still the case. They can still do what they want. And whether you call it discrimination or just their mode of running business, they can do it.
But what's going to happen? This doesn't seem, I'm so curious about this, because even as a younger person, I remember, I think it was George W. was talking a lot about educational savings accounts, privatizing health insurance, or different, I think it was health insurance. No, he wanted to privatize Social Security. There it was. So privatizing Social Security, and then voucher systems. And I remember, even as a younger man, just having graduated from college, I think it was 2004, 2005, I was chatting with my brother, and he was explaining, he's like, well, look, the problem with this type of voucher system, again, this 20 years ago, he was explaining to me, he's like, well, separation of church and state, you can't fund a private Catholic school with public taxpayer dollars. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. But apparently you can.
Apparently now you can. So, and there's a lawsuit going on in Utah right now.
Okay, so there are some people bringing legal action.
Correct. And,
Gotcha.
and so we're watching to see what happens with that. They have a very similar Blaine amendment that we do. So we'll kind of see where that goes before we put a ton of time and effort into it. But at the end of the day, this is a Republican platform push. And we saw President Trump tweet out on it, right? When's the president ever said anything about Idaho ever? You know what I mean? And somehow we get a tweet saying, nice job, legislature and governor. It's just amazing to me.
Yeah, he tweeted about my cousin, Anna Polina in Florida. It's actually a relative of mine. He definitely tweeted her years ago. So he did that before he tweeted about Idaho. I'll just put that one out there. Well, what do you ultimately think the budget is going to balloon, and this will predominantly be taken advantage of by people that already have means, that are already likely in the private school system, or already going to very good public schools? Yeah,
again, for me, this isn't a thing about school choice. This is a thing about funding, right? What are we funding? Because the choice has always been there. You can choose to go, if if you had a student and you were in poverty, is $5,000 going to make it so you can go to a private school?
Well, I actually spoke with President IFF, Ron Nate, had him on a couple times earlier in the session. And we were actually chatting about this exact thing, which is, the $5,000 ticket is not enough. Like, I don't know any private school in the area that's under, I think like $9,000 is the cheapest one I know of. And for me, I have 3 boys, right? And for me, if I wanted to transition my kids into the private school, let's call it $10,000 tuition, I'd still have to come up with $15,000 in order to actually afford that. And I don't have an extra $15,000 sitting around on an annual basis for the next, I don't know, forever until they graduate. Like my youngest is in 2nd grade. So it seemed interesting to me because like, okay, I understand this 5,000 is here, but for how many people will that actually make the difference? Plus, it is also my understanding from people that know more about economics than I do, that as you have more people going after a fixed number of items and you have more money going after, it's like every time you pass go, Baltic and Mediterranean become more valuable than like $16.80. They're my favorite, by the way. Yeah. The little like brown guys right next to go. But as you have more money circulating, obviously that's what happens to the housing market. You have people moving in here with more money and the housing market goes up. Well, if you have, open seats in a private school, and then those open seats evaporate, and then you have more people coming in that have this turbocharged $5,000 credit, you're going to have an increase in tuition because the seats will be worth more.
Supply and demand.
So theoretically, not only is the $5,000 insufficient at the $10,000 tuition mark, but that $10,000 tuition mark won't stay there for very long. It'll likely creep up to 11, 12, and 13.
So again, we've seen that in other states. That is not that's not an uncommon thing that you see.
This is going to be wild.
I don't know if it's wild because it's at the cost of our public kids, right? Of our most precious resource, and we're giving some better opportunities than others depending on where you live in the state.
Well, if I may, and again, I don't know that we're really offering the kids with means better educational opportunities, right? Like we're just offering more,
correct,
more choice. Like, no, we're not even offering more choice. We're offering money to supply the existing choice, because people can already choose to go to private school. Correct. They just don't get the money from, some farmer in Chalice. Right now they get the money from the farmer in Chalice, or like, Stoney Winston, the superintendent of Fruitland. He was like, listen, why is some farmer or rancher here going to be funding somebody in the Treasure Valley? That doesn't make sense at all. If somebody in the Treasure Valley wants to go to the private school, go to the private school. But like, we don't even have private schools. He was saying that of the 4,000 students in his immediate vicinity, he said fewer than 50 go to a private school. And he was like, if you think private schools are going to pop up, like we just don't have that population density, which is ultimately one of the limiting factors of the rural school districts. It's like you don't have the population density and enough people that can overcome the financial barrier to just fund additional private schools. So the private schools don't exist in the rural areas. And the $5,000 mark is not going to change that. Like you still need more money and more students available. Yeah, it's going to be wild.
And I think another interesting thing is that what are we going to see next year for those people that don't have kids in school? Should I get a tax break because I don't have any kids going to school? Should I get a tax break because, I've been pulled over and I don't use the police force? My house hasn't burnt down. I mean, where does this go? Where does it stop? So if we start talking about tax breaks and, at some point we do it for the good of society, but this is a slippery slope, I think, that we're talking about when you start talking about tax breaks for people with means, for the most part.
That was one of the big pieces of this that I was trying to flush out as well. Was this touted as, or was one of the pillars of the argument that, hey, I pay taxes and right now you're restricting where I can pay taxes to, or where the benefit I get from taxes? Because that's the argument, which is like I put in,
correct,
and now you're saying I can't get that back out unless I go to your system, but I want that money to go to a different system. And if that's part of the big piece, I could see your, hey, I don't get pulled over, I shouldn't pay for the police force argument coming in.
Well, I just think that it opens up a whole bunch of doors for, all the folks that are retired on fixed incomes in Idaho saying, well, why am I paying for that? I don't have kids in school. I moved from another state, or, I just think it opens a lot of doors now that people are going to have to answer in the future of what is a tax break. And the other thing I think that's really interesting, if you look at some of the data we looked at how much people pay in versus how much they're getting out of it, it's not the same. right? You may get way more money back in a $5,000 tax credit than you ever paid in the system.
Well, I'll tell you what, considering my $0 an hour job plus benefits at this fantastic podcast, I can tell you conclusively that if Matt Todd and family took the voucher and got $15,000 annually, I tell you as sure as I sit here right now, I would be making I net positive. There's no way I pay $15,000 in, taxes to the state of Idaho that are meant to go to education at this point. Like, I'm a net recipient, and I've never understood that too. They can't, the people I've spoken with are like, oh, it's tax credit, tax credit. It's like, okay, but what if I don't pay in $15,000? Right. And they're like, well, you get your money back. I'm like, okay, yes, but where's the rest come from? They're like, well, it's like, I don't know. You just go round
and you
and
can
round.
get it up front. I mean, generally, I can get my tax rebate up front. Again, this is another interesting portion of this that they're going to have to flush out. I think there's going to be a lot of, and again, who's going to do it?
Well, look, I have no idea, but I do know one thing. I do not know what the right thing to do is. Like, that's my only saving grace. I feel like if I knew the right move, I would have a lot more burden going through this legislative session, because I'm like, well, that would be crazy. But I don't, like, it's not entirely clear to me what the right answer is. I hear the arguments that people bring forth saying, hey, this educational system has not served me well. Right now, mind you, even within my family, I have some students that go to a charter school. And that's state-funded charter school. It's like, God bless it. The state of Idaho produced this charter school. They fund it. My kids are the kids that go there are very well served. And then I have other kids in just the average, neighborhood public school. And I'm very happy with both. And we have this, parallel system that I was like, gosh, that's fantastic. I had these opportunities. So I very much understand parents' sentiment when they say, hey, the neighborhood public school is not serving me. Now, again, not everybody has a charter school alternative like I did. And again, I'm very pleased with that. I understand that. And I still couldn't see my way through or understand. It's like, okay, the public school is not working. So like, let's cut the $5,000 checks and just make sure parents hand us receipts. Like that I understood the problem. I just didn't understand how this was the best solution.
Yeah, and my first response is, tell me what's not working, right? I mean, is it because you have some angst against public schools? But when you look at public schools, we do fairly well. This whole idea that somehow public schools is failing is a false statement. I mean, I can show you any school district you want to look at in Idaho almost and be able to go in and show you scores and show kids are graduating and going on to college, going on to, CTE courses. I mean, we have so many opportunities in Idaho in public schools, both charter and traditional, that you're going to be hard-pressed for me to tell you that they're failing. Do they fail some kids? For sure they do, right? There's 330,000 kids in public education. There's going to be a handful that, are going to fall through the cracks or something happens to, but that's also reality, right? But for the most part, and for the majority of our kids, they do just fine in public education.
Right. Even within my family, I have many, many siblings, but in my original sibling group, I had an older brother that flunked out of the high school I went to. My sister, who was 1 year older than I was, graduated with like a 4.3 GPA, goes on to UC Davis. I graduate and go on to UC Berkeley. Now, again, that was three different people in the exact same family within, I think, 5 years going through the exact same school. So is that a failing of the school? Is that a failing of the family? Is that a failing of the individual? And since then, my brother has been fine. He went on and got a PhD in neuroscience. So like, obviously capable person, just wasn't hitting the mark with that school in that phase of his life. So I agree with what you're saying, which is, hey, look, you will have some students that for whatever reason in their life experience in that moment are not going to be the most successful that they, potentially will be in the long run. But, is that necessarily the fault of the school? Like my school in particular, I believe it opened up in the late 70s, early 80s, and it was heralded as this really, really great public school. And then they, in sometimes I believe the early 90s, they redrew the boundaries of the individual high schools. And my high school absorbed this mass immigration corridor on this place called Monument Boulevard. So all of these people that were, ESL students and language learners, all these things, they started getting corralled into this one set of elementary, middle, and public and high school. The high school teachers didn't change. The programs didn't change, but the scores of the school dropped precipitously. Like it was boom. It's like took an elevator up or stairs up and elevator straight down. And there were all calls for all kinds of reform from the school. It's like, we didn't change. Right. The population changed. The needs of the population changed, but the school itself didn't change. So at what point is the outcome from a variable student body with variable needs and issues the fault of the system that they get inserted into?
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing you have to add to that is that if you're the parent of any of those kids, your education of that kid is the most important thing for you.
Right.
Right. And so, as an administrator, again, I had roughly 950 kids. I had parents coming in on all kinds of issues, right. when we hear about, well, you guys are teaching this or you're promoting this. I'm like, maybe because of parents coming in and forcing us to, right? Or saying, you got to take care of our kids' needs, which might be something different than what you're okay with.
Right.
We don't go out looking for things to try and irritate our communities, right? The community brings them to us. Like your example of just saying who's moving in. And, what we saw over COVID was this huge, massive increase of families from all over Washington, Oregon, Utah, California. We saw this huge group of people, and every one of them bring different ideas that aren't from Idaho, and we don't turn away kids, right?
Right.
Our doors are open, and our job is to educate every kid that comes through the door. And that can look a whole lot different today than it did 2 decades ago.
Andy, I appreciate you, sir. Thank you for coming in and talking about this. I would love to keep this conversation going. Obviously, education is very important in the state of Idaho. This is the law now. 93 is passed. It's been signed. Okay, so what do we do? How do we keep improving our schools as best we can? How do we deal with the laws as they are? And how do we, definitely keep track of this program that in other states it appears is not, doing fantastically as far as, fiscal responsibility and accountability. So thank you for coming in today. I hope we can keep the conversation going. Let's do it again.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.